All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I am the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and I've recorded more than 5,000 interviews going back to 2003, all of which are available at scotthorton.org. You can also sign up for the podcast feed. The full archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, on the line is Jeb Sprague. He is a research associate at the University of California, Riverside, and previously taught at UVA and UCSB. He's the author of Globalizing the Caribbean, Political Economy, Social Change, and the Transnational Capitalist Class, and also Paramilitarism and the Assault on Democracy in Haiti. And if you go back and check the archives, you can find where we did one interview in the past on the subject of Haiti there. But this one is about a new article in the Gray Zone Project. That's thegrayzone.com. It's called Top Bolivian Coup Plotters Trained by U.S. Military's School of the Americas. Served as attachés in FBI police programs. Oh, you don't say, Jeb. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks so much, Scott, for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to have you here. And so we had Ted Snyder on and Dan McAdams about the Bolivia coup, so we got our kind of 101 here, but maybe you can refresh people's memory or for any brand new listeners to the show and let us know about what happened, kind of the overall thumbnail sketch of the coup of November the 10th there.
Yeah, so Bolivia, it's a country in the heart of South America, and it's gone through an integration into the global economy over recent decades. But unlike a lot of the other countries around it, it's been headed up by a Latin American left-leaning government, and with very vibrant social movements, political movements on the ground, and they've broken with IMF policies, with the diktat from Washington. And a lot has happened in the country. There are a lot of local particularities, tensions, contradictions, all sorts of things. But one thing is for sure is that in late October of 2019, the government of Evo Morales, the first ever elected indigenous president in the history of South America, he won with a mandate. He beat his nearest competitor by over 11%. And according to the rules, their constitution, he had passed the bar to become the elected president. And the country is majority indigenous, working class people, marginalized, negatively racialized population. And he is very popular with that base of support in the country. But what we saw happen was in the lead up to November 10th, which is the day of the coup that we want to talk about today, there was this campaign carried out by the Organization of American States, working with some local Bolivian groups to really delegitimize that election and create this narrative of an electoral crisis. Now, the OAS has done things like this before. They've done it in Haiti, which eventually led to the undermining of a progressive government there. The OAS has this history, right, of taking the side of Washington and a lot of dirty wars in the region. And so in the lead up to November 10th, studies were put out by this group called CEPR, Center for Economic Policy Research in Washington, D.C., that did a statistical analysis of the election. There's also an academic at the University of Michigan who carried out another independent study. And they came to the conclusion that the election was overwhelmingly legitimate, that Evo Morales should be have this new term in office. And but basically the OAS carried out the smear campaign of the election. The OAS is 60% funded by the United States. It's really made up mostly of a lot of neoliberal and conservative governments across the region that side with Washington. And the media just repeated this narrative. And so by the 10th, there was around 100,000 Twitter bot accounts that were made, that it was very much clearly an organized, concerted campaign to delegitimize the election and to really attack Morales as a dictator. And so on the 9th, there was a rebellion by a head of the police. And then on the 10th, the military asked him to step down. His supporters have been hunted down, people kicked out of office. Openly racist woman, Jeanine Áñez, who's been very harsh. You read her language, very racist language against the indigenous majority. She's been made the de facto head of this new regime. And so that's what we're seeing now in Bolivia.
Okay, a couple questions there real quick. Is it really right then that the only question was whether he had won by a margin large enough to not have to have a runoff and a second round?
Well, there's a whole debate if you follow this closely. So, in the history of the United States, we have a 2-term limit on presidential.
Well, hang on 1 second on the term limit thing, because that's kind of a separate question. But I just wonder on the particulars of this election, you're saying that he won by 11%. If I understand right, if he had won by less than 10, then because he has less than a majority, he only has a plurality. If he had less than a 10% margin above his nearest opponent, then he would have to do a runoff election. But if he has 10 or more, 11 counts, then he doesn't have to do a runoff election. So what I'm asking is, are the opposition saying that he really lost the election outright, or they're saying that it just must have been within the margin less than 10%?
I think you'll have different people in the opposition claiming different things. Some will say that he inched over and that it was illegitimate. Other people will say that he lost by a wide margin and that it was fraud, and they take up this OAS narrative. So different people. There's different factions within the opposition. So there are different claims made. There's some people that claim that he's been a dictator for years, and so you see this real heavily across social media. But if you go by the CEPR study, they have a long track record of getting it right. What they argue is that the rural vote, the people in the rural countryside, where it's much more indigenous, that took longer for those votes to come into the center vote, where they gather all the votes, and so it took longer, and so the opposition tries to claim, well, he had fudged the election, but there's no, there's no widespread evidence of fraud. They haven't presented any major cases of vote buying or, something that would have changed the percentage that much. And anyhow, rather than going through the Supreme Court or the different constitutional mechanisms within the country, or even if, say, he had been thrown out, why doesn't his vice president or the head of, their country, their Congress take over, which would be according to the Constitution? So there's like a number of people that would be in line after him that should have come into power. If say the other mechanisms had voted to remove him, but that's not what happened. The military not only pushed him out, but they also refused and have hunted down other officials of his party, leading officials, burning down homes. They ransacked his house, his sister's house. They even ran over his dog with a tank. He had security officials around him, his own bodyguards being. They have text messages showing that they were being offered like $50,000 to betray him. So it was definitely a concerted campaign, and with the Twitter accounts, there's a lot of other factors too that we could go into, or we can talk about the military and police guys.
Let's do that. Let's do that in just a moment. I just want to bring up one more thing, which is, I think, probably the strongest argument of the other side is that he should have left power a long time ago. They held a referendum about expanding term limits, and that side lost. But then the court said, nah, it's okay. Term limits are unconstitutional, even though they're in the Constitution. And so you can go ahead and run again. And that sure smacks of a will to power and outside the law. On the other hand, if you can imagine the same thing here, where the Supreme Court decides that actually Donald Trump can run for a third term if he wants to, would that mean then that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff gets to roll over to the White House and remove him from the chair? Not civilian cops, not an impeachment in the House and the Senate and removal, not the rule of law, but the Army is going to come in here and make sure that the Supreme Court and Donald Trump can't get away with that? Is that what we would accept? Never even mind the foreign intervention, but just for the sake of the way things are there. As you're saying, it's such an important point here, that presume that what they say is right about all the different ways he cheated. Well, then what? A coup d'etat? No. I thought America's whole excuse for killing everybody around the world all the time was because we're giving them democracy. Instead, everywhere we go, we're canceling one. Whenever anybody votes wrong, they get removed. So now we get to the part, well, you can say whatever you want about that rant if you want. But then we get to the part of how America's government is up to Uncle Sam's eyeballs in this thing here.
Yeah, those are some good points. And I mean, in our own country, presidents only serve 2 terms. But you will remember a man named FDR who was actually elected to a 4th term. He died before he could serve out that term, but he was really sort of at an important historical juncture in our country in a lot of ways. Morales is a vital historical juncture in the history of Bolivia, where for the first time, indigenous people are brought into the process. And I think it's a valid argument in regards to him choosing to run a 4th term. If that was a bad idea, he could have run as vice president. But the thing is that referendum on him having a term limit, that happened in 2016, and he barely lost it. I think it was like 1 or 2 percentage points that he lost that by. And then after that, they went through the constitutional mechanisms through the Supreme Court that ruled that it was against his human rights to not be able to run another term. And so he did that. And then if we go by the CEPR study with the statistical analysis, the opposition has not presented there hasn't been any clear evidence of like fraud on a structural level in this election. They just haven't presented it. And so if we go by the CEPR study and he won by 11%, why is that 2% loss in 2016 sacrosanct, but yet his win in this election in October is not sacrosanct? So why is one so important but not the other? But I agree with you. Whatever the case, this shouldn't, the U.S. shouldn't be intervening. It shouldn't be our decision or, in supporting one side or another. This should be, up to them locally to figure this out and through their mechanisms there on the ground.
It's really sad to say, but it's true. I saw a video of a guy from the Cato Institute, who is not from the Foreign Policy Department, which is all really good guys, but he's from some of the Latin America department or whatever over at Cato. And it was really funny to hear him justify all of what has happened in terms of the illegality of Evo Morales and all of his people and abusing the process and staying in office and all these things. But when it comes to the military overthrowing him, wow, what choice do they have? And when it comes to some random senator declaring herself presidente for now, well, geez, the guy fled to Mexico. We got to have somebody in there and this kind of thing. And in the name of libertarianism, because, hey, as long as the guy, the people seizing power are to the right of these leftists, then I guess it's just perfectly fine, which is completely crazy. And you don't hear that kind of thing out of their foreign policy department. You certainly don't hear that kind of thing out of antiwar.com or the Ron Paul Institute or any of the leaders on foreign policy in the libertarian community. But that kind of propaganda works on some because, hey, we don't like socialism. And so, geez, if somebody is doing something about socialism out there somewhere, I guess we just have to get behind whatever it might be, including, as you're saying, I'm just drawing the contrast there. Oh, what's sacrosanct and what's not? This guy's breaking the rules, so now we can break every rule in the world in order to get rid of him. And that just goes without saying, of course, somehow, It's ridiculous.
Also Evo Morales, if you study it, if you look at the political economy of what happened under him, it was very moderate in a lot of ways. They use the word socialism, and there are infrastructure for the poor and different things. But wealthy people had it good in Bolivia over the last 2 decades. They had it really well. I mean, in the United States, they talk about everything like it's Stalinism. I mean, there's no differentiation. And I think part of it, I mean, I'm sure some of you might disagree, or some of your listeners might disagree, but I think the center of gravity of our country is so far to the right because we've never really, since World War I and Eugene V. Debs and in the late 19th century, when they made it where labor unions can't have general strikes, where they have to divide up into different sectoral labor unions. We've never had a left in our country. We've had sort of like liberal identitarianism. There was the New Deal, FDR Democrats. But in other countries, especially in the global South, there are actual socialists, variety of different communists, Marxists, leftists, anarchists, that have a much bigger history in those countries. In our country, we don't have that. And so any sort of debate, it's put in very simplistic terms in my view.
Well, Murray Rothbard, Mr. Libertarian, said that, hey, land reform in third world countries is in no way, or it should never be presumed that that's de facto Marxist, communist, collectivist, and anti-liberty. In fact, all of the rich, white, right-wingers in power across Latin America got their land grants from the King of Spain or some kind of thing, traditional feudalism harking back, or American corporations like United Fruit or whoever, buying up from illegitimate power land that truly belonged to other people and this kind of thing. So you could even presumably, conceivably, have a right-wing government that could come to power in any one of these countries, kick foreign interests out, kick feudal landlords off their property, give the property to the people who really worked that land in a John Lockean natural right sense, divide it up among the actual property owners. And that would be a severe land reform that would be in no way communist. It would just be in the interest of justice. So we shouldn't conflate all these things together. I'm not sure if it's ever happened like that, but it certainly could, and it would be right to. But anyway, I'm sorry. So teach us all about the School of the Americas and all of these guys involved, the U.S. involvement here.
So the article, this article that I published with the Gray Zone, where it really looks then at a microscope at really the anatomy of this coup. And so the previous book I published, Paramilitarism and the Assault on Democracy in Haiti, that we talked in an earlier interview about, I had got thousands of Freedom of Information Act documents where I was really able to trace back the role of U.S. policymakers, elites in the State Department, and U.S. intelligence to really work closely with Haitian police and ex-military people in really sort of trying to manage the country and carry out what they call, transition initiatives, political transitions, quote unquote, democracy promotion. And so I was curious then, well, what about Bolivia? There was just this coup that happened. So I looked at the different people that had been heads of the police and the military when this regime change took place on the 10th. There was a phone call that had been leaked. I don't know who gathered this leak. Either somebody released it from the phone call, or maybe the Bolivian police. I don't know who, but it's been
Russia.
all over. It's Russia. It's been all over Bolivian media, where you can hear and journalists. Everyone says this is like a legitimate. These are real people. These people have been identified, and so there's a number of callers on the phone. And they're talking about working with some different evangelical groups, with Bolsonaro, the neo-fascistic president in Brazil, right, who's called for killing homosexuals, the ex-president Uribe, right, who was so close to death squads in Colombia, and then they also talk about support from Bob Menendez and who's your senator there in Texas?
Ted Cruz. I'm sad to say,
yeah, Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, of course. And so they talk about working with these people and carrying out this coup. And I took the names of these guys because they introduced themselves or are introduced in this phone call. And I found in total 5 of them had gone to the School of the Americas, the Fort Benning Pentagon Department of Defense training center in Georgia for Latin American and Caribbean military officials that have such a long history of being involved in massacres and coups, like, or the rapes in El Salvador, and such a long history of that. And then I looked at the head of the military and the head of the police, and the head of the military had also attended the School of the Americas, the guy that asked Morales to step down. And then the head of the police, who was really the key official, this guy named Williams Kaliman, and he would meet with Morales every Monday. They would have security meetings. And so I think his betrayal really caught Morales off guard. But he had worked as an attaché in Washington. And in 2018, he had spent a lot of time in D.C., where he was the head of a group named APALA, which is a group that brings police chiefs across Latin America to work in Washington, D.C., and they really coordinate and do training and close operations work with the FBI, ICE, the DEA. And so in the article, I go over that, and then I also talk about Philip Agee, who's the first big CIA whistleblower who died a couple years ago, but published a book in 1975 called Inside the Company, where he talks about how the CIA utilizes other federal agencies like the FBI, the DEA, how they operate often through them. A CIA agent just can't go up to somebody and say, "Hey, I work for the CIA. Can I get information from you, or can maybe I slowly start to recruit you?" They can't operate like that. So they operate through other agencies. And so the article goes into this and kind of lays out the case for definite U.S. involvement and influence on this regime change.
Mm-hmm. I guess we don't, is there any direct information about the Americans giving the go-ahead here? Or we do have strong connections between the people, certainly.
Exactly. Well, so there's, Trump has called it like a great victory for democracy.
Right, America
right?
Immediately endorsed it, right?
Immediately. Mm-hmm. But also, this hasn't been confirmed, but there's been reports in the Bolivian media. I'm trying to investigate this more because I almost don't even want to say it, because it's just, at this point, I can't confirm it. But there have been suggestions that the head of the police there was reports saying he had been paid off with $1 million, and that he had gotten a visa to the United States. But this is still, like, at this point, that's just that's not confirmed, but it has been reported in some Bolivian media outlets.
Hold on just one second, be right back. So you're constantly buying things from Amazon.com. Well, that makes sense. They bring it right to your house. So what you do, though, is click through from the link in the right-hand margin at scotthorton.org, and I'll get a little bit of a kickback from Amazon's end of the sale. Won't cost you a thing. Nice little way to help support the show. Again, that's right there in the margin at scotthorton.org. Hey, y'all, check it out. The Libertarian Institute, that's me and my friends, have published 3 great books this year. First is No Quarter, The Ravings of William Norman Grigg. He was the best one of us. Now he's gone, but this great collection is a truly fitting legacy for his fight for freedom. I know you'll love it. Then there's Coming to Palestine by the great Sheldon Richman. It's a collection of 40 important essays he's written over the years about the truth behind the Israel-Palestine conflict. You'll learn so much and highly value this definitive libertarian take on the dispossession of the Palestinians and the reality of their brutal occupation. And last but not least is the great Ron Paul, The Scott Horton Show Interviews 2004 through 2019. Interview transcripts of all of my interviews of the good doctor over the years on all the wars, money, taxes, the police state, and more. So how do you like that? Pretty good, right? Find them all at libertarianinstitute.org/books. You need stickers for your band or your business? Well, Rick and the guys over at thebumpersticker.com have got you covered. Great work, great prices, sticky things with things printed on them. Whatever you need, thebumpersticker.com will get it done right for you. Thebumpersticker.com. All right, tell us more about this leaked audio, if you could.
So, yeah, the leaked audio, it's basically these 5 or 6 guys that are talking on like a conference call, and they talk about, it's really out of the CIA playbook what they're talking about. They talk about assaulting like the political party offices of the MAS, the Movement for Socialism, which is the political party of Evo Morales, and trying to go after journalists and activists, right, that were aligned with that political project. And they also talk about, this is really out of the CIA playbook, trying to find labor unions that they could find that would split from Morales, and that they could work to, block roads and cause a lot of problems in the country. That, I mean, the idea here, right, is that old strategy of death by 1,000 cuts, where, there was a whole project by some environmentalist groups to blame a fire in the Amazon forest on the Morales government, when we really know it was mostly in Brazil, and Morales responded much quicker to the forest fires than Bolsonaro did across the border in Brazil. So, with the Twitter campaign, it's clear, this was very much of a contemporary hybrid warfare, soft power campaign, through social media, through normal traditional media outlets. And so this phone call is really by these ex-military colonels that had been involved in the SOA, and one of them brags about all of his contacts within the military that he's communicating with.
Within the U.S. military?
No, within the Bolivian military. And so,
but you're saying he's a party leader, and he's bragging to the other guys that I have this back channel going with the armed forces.
He's an ex-colonel in the Bolivian military, and he's talking about this. Then there's a number. So each of these guys kind of have their own thing going on, and they're working together with one another. But there's one guy that they talk about who's an ex-colonel living in the United States, that is a ex-mayor of Cochabamba and an ex-presidential candidate. And so they go over that. But I mean, what's clear is that really the military and police command structure really had been substantially cultivated by the U.S. through the School of the Americas, this military training program. And these people clearly have contacts in the foreign policy establishment and within some of the neoconservative elements in the GOP. And so what's shocking about the whole thing is that how so many people have jumped on board this in Washington. I mean, you really see the bipartisan nature of the foreign policy establishment. I mean, even Elizabeth Warren basically refused to call it a coup. I mean, I haven't seen what libertarian politicians have said, but I know Bernie Sanders came out, directly called it a coup, and I think he also had opposed the Pentagon military increase. But I think we need to put significant pressure on candidates, independents, Republicans, Democrats, people in elected office to resist this permanent war state and the things like the School of the Americas. There's a group called School of the Americas Watch that every year it's headed up by mostly religious organizations, reverends, nuns, and different priests, where your listeners have probably heard of. They go once a year and they protest in front of the School of the Americas. So we really need to build back up the anti-war movement in our country, because we see how this regime change apparatus is really trying to mold itself ever deeper into our psyche and in social media. And how now they have so many intelligence people that are working in like MSNBC and CNN and Fox News. So many of them get jobs in these big media outlets. So it's more and more clear the way that they operate and the bipartisan nature of this thing.
Yeah, well, that's certainly true, and it's certainly no surprise to hear that about Elizabeth Warren. As far as the libertarian candidates, I presume the best about all of them, but I know that Jacob Hornberger, I don't think he's written about Bolivia yet, but I know he's good on it and has a long track record of being good on all the Latin American coups from, Arbenz in 54 all the way through. he talks about Chile 73 like it was yesterday constantly. So
yeah, Arbenz in 54 is so important too, because a guy named Che Guevara was riding through his motorcycle in Guatemala in 1954, and so when they saw what happened to an elected government when it tried to do land reforms and was overthrown, that's one of the reasons that Che Guevara, figured, well, hey, I mean, the only way we can carry out these reforms to benefit the people is if we take a more regimented, hierarchical, covert, that whole vanguard Marxist-Leninist policy. So, you see this history of blowback when the U.S. carries out these operations. People see how that affects their life, and then it has reactions. So just like what happened in Afghanistan, right? Our operations around the world, have long-term impacts on so many people and societies.
Well, that's certainly true. And, it's interesting that in the 21st century, well, I guess certainly in the kind of Bush years, they're so focused on the Middle East that they sort of, quote unquote, allowed a lot of these leftists to come to power in the first place. From their point of view, from the empire's point of view, they were kind of neglecting Latin America, whereas now they care more again, as they did. And, starting during Obama, they backed the coup in Honduras in 2009, at least after the fact, if not before the fact, just like here. But possibly before the fact. I don't mean to dismiss that. And so, and that push has been going on. And certainly when Trump came into power, he's not been shy at all about announcing that he's essentially directing the CIA to get rid of all the Latin American leftists. So here we are.
Yeah, no, it's very clear. And I think, it goes back to that when Hugo Chavez came out against the free trade zone of the Americas, right? I think that was in like 2001 when Bush was trying to have a free trade zone of the entire Western Hemisphere, and Hugo Chavez came out against it. And he had been, kind of center left, and then Bush, attempted that coup in 2002. And, at that point, Chavez said, well, hey, I got to work with the Cubans or, I'm going to get killed. So, U.S. policy, there's a history of colonialism, a history of empire, and people in the global South, they know that history. So I think, if we want to have a more stable, humanitarian, future, or, that we want for our children, our children's children, I think resisting the war machine here, really in the belly of the empire, is, one of the very most important things that we can do with our life, and figuring out effective ways to do that, and impacting, as many people as we can, and getting them to think outside of that box.
Yeah. Well, and of course, the whole thing here is that obviously the Americans don't really care if a government is socialist or not. It's whether they're independent from the American government's priorities or not. And so it's, compliance is what they seek. And if there are Americans who are truly concerned, and for good reason in a lot of cases, about these countries turning to the left. But if the leftists are the only ones who really value independence, and the right-wingers are all in league with the Americans, then who do you think is the major cause of socialism in Latin America, if not the USA and the red, white, and blue? As you're saying, this whole thing is all blowback in the first place, second place, and third place.
Yeah, you're right. And there's governments right in Europe that have more socialistic policies, like say, in Scandinavia, but countries that are part of NATO. So they fit within that, that foreign policy apparatus of Washington. And so, yeah, you're right. We don't have a problem with them. If they're part of the, if they're part of this behemoth that we have. So, yeah, I appreciate the chance to be able to speak to your listeners and come together on this.
Yeah, well, I'm really happy to have had you on the show today to talk about it, and really to familiarize people with the concept too. There are a lot of people listening to this show who are born in this century and know even less than me about American policy in Latin America, and I'm no expert on this stuff at all. I got vague outlines going back decades, but not in-depth study like you have here. But I know that means that there are a lot of people who don't know the first thing about the tyranny of America, of the USA in Latin America, over the centuries really here. So
there's great
I'm sure
books
this will
out
be a
there.
good start for a lot of people interested to learn more about the whole broader subject too.
Great. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Yep, me too. All right, you guys, that is Jeb Sprague, and he is writing at thegrayzone.com, the Gray Zone Project. It's called Top Bolivian Coup Plotters Trained by U.S. Military's School of the Americas, served as attachés in FBI police programs. All right, y'all, thanks. Find me at libertarianinstitute.org, at scotthorton.org, antiwar.com, and reddit.com/Scott Horton Show. Oh, yeah, and read my book, Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, at foolserrand.us.